The wind moved softly across the endless prairie, carrying with it the smell of dust, the creak of old wood, and the faint ringing of a church bell. It was a sound most townsfolk usually welcomed, a call to gather in worship or to mark a happy union. But this morning, the bell tolled not for love freely chosen. It tolled for a union the town council had deemed necessary, one that carried no laughter or joy. Clara Dawson stood at the foot of the church steps, her black dress clinging to her frame in the restless breeze. Her gloved hands twisted in front of her as she tried to steady the tremble in her fingers. She had only buried her husband, Sheriff Matthew Dawson, a few short months ago. The man had been a pillar of justice, his badge both feared and respected. And now, while her grief still weighed heavy, the town had decided she could not remain a widow alone. A woman alone, they said, invited trouble, especially one tied to a man like the sheriff, who had left enemies in his wake. The murmurs of the gathered crowd pressed on her like a physical force. Women whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes darting between her pale face and the preacher who stood ready to bind her to another. Men shifted their weight, some nodding approval, others frowning as though unsure this was right. Clara wanted to run, to scream that she was not livestock to be bartered, not some helpless child to be passed from one hand to another. But her voice had been drowned long ago, swallowed by grief, and now replaced with an obedience the town demanded. The preacher's words rang out, strong and steady, as he announced the town's decision. The name fell heavy in the air, each syllable striking Clara's chest like a stone. Elias McGraw. The man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, the sunlight cutting across his broad frame. His dark hat shaded his eyes, but nothing could mask the air of brooding silence that clung to him. He was taller than most, his shoulders square, his stride purposeful yet reluctant, as if each step toward her was a weight he had no wish to carry. The murmurs grew louder, some in surprise, others in quiet satisfaction. Elias McGraw was not a stranger. He was known in the way storms are known, distant, unpredictable, and best left unchallenged. Clara had seen him only a handful of times before, usually riding into town for supplies. He was a man of few words, his face carved by hardship, his voice low as gravel, his eyes shadowed with something no one dared ask about. People whispered about his past, about a family he'd lost, about duels fought in silence, about scars no one could see. Now here he was, summoned to the steps of the church not by choice but by decree. Clara's throat tightened as the preacher placed them side by side, reading vows that felt hollow. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "I do," her voice breaking like glass under strain. Elias's reply came rough and curt, the words forced from him as though they cut his tongue to speak. When the preacher declared them man and wife, the crowd erupted in applause, some clapping with relief, others nodding with the approval of a problem solved. Clara felt none of their satisfaction. She felt only the press of invisible chains around her wrists, binding her to a future she hadn't chosen. Elias removed his hat briefly, not in triumph but out of respect for the ceremony, then placed it back upon his head, his jaw clenched, his gaze unreadable. Clara stole a glance at him, searching for some trace of kindness, of warmth. All she found was a wall of silence, a man as closed off as the mountains on the horizon. The walk from the church to the cabin the town had assigned them was short, but it felt like miles. Children whispered behind them, women tugged their shawls tighter, as if guarding against some unseen omen, and the men returned to their business, satisfied that order had been restored. Clara's heart pounded as she stepped inside the small home. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood and smoke, the single room tidy but bare. A fire crackled weakly in the hearth, and a table stood set for two, though neither of them touched it. Elias leaned against the wall, arms folded, his shadow stretching long in the flickering firelight. Clara sat stiffly in the wooden chair, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap like a schoolgirl awaiting instruction. Silence pressed thick between them. Clara's breath came shallow, her chest rising and falling with the weight of words unsaid. At last, she whispered, her voice raw with fear and bitterness, "Why you?" Elias's head turned slowly toward her, his eyes narrowing just slightly, though not in anger. His reply was quiet, steady, his voice like stone dragged across earth. "Because no other man would take the sheriff's widow. Because they think I'm strong enough to keep you safe." He paused, his jaw tightening, the firelight catching the hardened lines of his face. "But don't mistake this for choice. I didn't ask for this." The bluntness of his tone stung like a lash, and Clara's eyes burned with sudden tears. She rose from the chair, her skirts brushing the floor as she hurried into the small adjoining room. The door clicked shut behind her, and she leaned against it, pressing her hand to her mouth to muffle the sob that broke free. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the fire danced and twisted. Her heart ached with the weight of everything she had lost and everything being forced upon her now. She wondered how long she could live like this, bound to a man of silence and shadows, a stranger who carried his own storms. Elias, left alone by the fire, remained where he stood. His eyes were fixed on the flames, though his mind was far away, back to the ghosts he carried in silence. He had vowed never to let himself be pulled into another life, another family, another bond that could be torn away. Yet here he was, tied to a woman who carried her own grief, her own chains. His fists tightened at his sides, his breath heavy as he tried to steady the storm in his chest. He knew what the town expected of him: protection, duty, strength. What they did not know was that his strength had been fractured long ago, and though his body still stood, parts of him had never healed. Long into the night, Clara stared at the ceiling in the small room, her thoughts churning, her tears drying on her cheeks. And in the other room, Elias sat in silence, his eyes never leaving the fire. Neither of them slept, neither of them spoke again. Both of them wondered how long they could carry the weight of a marriage born not from love but from necessity. Yet beneath the silence, beneath the bitterness, something else lingered, something unspoken, a spark neither could yet admit to feeling. Weeks stretched into months, and though the prairie rolled on in silence, life between Clara and Elias was anything but still. At first, they lived as strangers bound by law and duty, their movements around one another cautious, their words clipped and careful. Yet as the days bled into one another, the vast emptiness of the land and the nearness of their lives began to carve away the distance that each had sworn to keep. The prairie had a way of testing souls, of stripping them bare until all that remained was truth. Clara found herself waking earlier than she once had, the sound of Elias's boots on the porch often stirring her from restless dreams. He rose before dawn, moving with the quiet determination of a man who had long relied only on himself. She would hear him, splitting wood, hear the steady thud of his axe as she prepared the small stove for breakfast. Their conversations were practical, at first. He would ask if there was enough flour. She would tell him where she'd set his shirt after mending it. The words were simple, but beneath them, a rhythm was forming, unspoken yet undeniable. One morning, Clara stumbled in the barn while lifting a bucket brimming with water. The weight dragged at her slender arms until it slipped, spilling across the dirt floor. She gasped in frustration, muttering at herself as she knelt to right the pail. Elias appeared without a sound, crouching beside her. His calloused hand brushed hers as he lifted the bucket with ease, his strength so effortless it startled her. He did not scold, nor did he speak more than necessary. "Too heavy," he muttered, carrying the pail to its place. But Clara caught something in his eyes, a flicker of concern, quickly masked by his usual silence. She stood there a moment longer, her breath uneven, realizing that beneath his hardened exterior, he noticed. It became clearer with time. At night, Clara often woke to find him seated by the window, his rifle across his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She asked him once why he never seemed to rest. His voice, low and even, carried across the dim glow of the fire. "Because I know what waits in the dark. The men who killed your husband didn't vanish. They'll come back, and if they do, they'll come through me first." The raw certainty in his words chilled her, but it also settled something deep inside. For the first time since Matthew's death, Clara felt safe, not because she was guarded by a badge, but because Elias had taken the danger upon himself. As spring ripened into summer, they began to share more than just duties. Elias showed Clara how to saddle a horse properly, guiding her hands with his rough palms steadying her smaller ones. She, in turn, taught him small comforts he had long neglected, how to season stew with a sprig of thyme, how to patch a torn sleeve so it would last the season. Their conversations deepened, no longer tethered to chores but wandering into memories. Clara spoke of her childhood back east, the lilacs her mother planted along their fence. Elias rarely spoke of his past, but one evening as they sat by the fire, he told her in a voice as brittle as dry leaves about a brother he once had, a boy quick to laugh, taken too soon by fever. Clara listened quietly, her heart softening at the rare gift of his truth. But it was not all gentle. There were days when grief sharpened Clara's words into knives, when she would accuse fate, God, or the town of stealing her choices. Elias bore her anger in silence, his jaw tightening, his eyes shadowed, until her fury spent itself and she collapsed in tears. Then, without speaking, he would leave her a cup of water by her side, or throw another log on the fire to warm the room. These small mercies, though wordless, spoke louder than any sermon of comfort. One evening, the prairie sky burned red with sunset, the fields bathed in gold. Clara stepped outside, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked to the horizon where Matthew used to ride, her heart heavy with the ache of memory. Her voice, barely more than a whisper, escaped her lips. "Matthew, why did you leave me here?" Her tears blurred the fading light, her chest tight with loneliness. Elias stepped from the barn, his hands still rough with work, a rag tucked in his belt. He froze when he saw her standing there, her figure outlined by the last of the day's light, her face streaked with tears. For a moment, he wanted to turn away. Silence had always been his shield, the wall behind which he hid from the pain of others and his own. But Clarice, sorrow drew him closer despite himself. He stood beside her, unsure, awkward, his presence as solid as the earth beneath their boots. "You miss him," he said softly, the words simple but heavy with understanding. Her voice broke, raw with the wound of love lost. "Every day, but it's not just him I miss. It's me, the woman I used to be. She died with him." Her shoulders trembled as she choked back another sob. Elias's chest tightened. He knew that feeling too well, the way grief robbed not only those you loved but the parts of yourself that once felt alive. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand rough and warm against her cheek. She startled at the touch, her breath catching as his thumb brushed away a tear. "Don't say that," he murmured, his voice husky. "You're still here, stronger than you know." Her eyes lifted to his, wide and searching, and for the first time, she saw past his brooding silence to the man buried underneath. Their gazes held, and the world seemed to still around them. The wind hushed, the prairie hushed, as though it too leaned in to listen. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Elias leaned down, his breath mingling with hers. Clara's heart thundered in her chest, her lips trembling as his neared. When at last they touched, the kiss was not hurried nor practiced. It was raw, unsteady, yet filled with a hunger long denied. Her hands rose to clutch his shirt, her body trembling as though every moment of grief and longing had poured into that single spark of contact. When he pulled back, his breath unsteady, his eyes still locked with hers, Elias whispered, "I swore I'd never feel again. But you lit the fire I thought was gone." Clara's tears fell freely now, but they were no longer carved of sorrow. They were a release, a surrender to something fragile but alive. For so long she had carried only grief. For so long he had carried only silence. Now, standing beneath the fading sky, both of them felt the fragile beginning of something new. From that night forward, the prairie did not feel as silent. There was still danger in the distance, shadows that threatened. There were still scars that would not heal overnight. But Clara and Elias had found something neither had expected, a spark that, once ignited, could burn against even the darkest night. And though they had not asked for this union, though it had been forced upon them by circumstance, it had become something more than duty. It had become the first breath of love.